Get started. Yeah, apparently a little bit, sorry, Mr. Kerr, for the loud hammer gavel there to get us started. Colleagues, great to see everyone back in full form after the holiday break. I hope you all had a great time with your family and your constituents. And we're back. Welcome to meeting number 89 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. I'm not going to go through the reminders because you guys are all veterans of this committee, so be good is the word from the chair. Before we get any further, you've all been the budget has been distributed for the study that we're currently under, the efforts to stabilize food prices. So assuming there's no issue, I'd like to see that adopted. Seeing no issue, there you go, Madam Clerk. Thank you. And so, colleagues, just in terms of substitutions, Mr. Epp will be in for Mr. Barlow at 1 o'clock or at 12 to 1. So we'll look forward to seeing Mr. Epp. And we'll miss you, Mr. Barlow. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 19th, 2023, the committee is resuming its study on efforts to stabilize food prices. And I'd now like to welcome our witnesses for this panel from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. No stranger to this committee or the agriculture community, Dr. Sylvain Charbois. Welcome back. Great to see you. And we also have Stacey Taylor, who is a PhD candidate. I think she's joining by video conference. There she is. Great to see you. Thanks for being here. From the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Keith Curry, who's the president, and Scott Ross is there. He is. He's on the line as well. Great to see you guys. Thanks for being back, Keith, in front of us. From the Retail Council of Canada, we have Deanne Brisebois, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer. Thank you for being here in the room with us. And we also have Carl Littler, who is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs. So great panel lined up today, colleagues. We're going to start with opening remarks for up to 5 minutes. Mr. Charbois, I'm going to start with you, and then we're coming to the CFA next. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. Today, I'm joined by one of our esteemed lab team members, Stacey Taylor, a recognized expert in accounting and food price forecasting in Canada. Please feel free to direct any questions regarding future food prices to her. As part of the committee's ongoing efforts to address the stabilization of food prices, we aim to address 3 key issues today: alleged grocer profiteering, price coordination, and the Grocer's Code of Conduct. Let's begin by the topic of profiteering. We have consistently emphasized that there is no substantiated evidence of profiteering within the food retail industry. To complement our findings from last year's reports, it is important to note that gross margins for all 3 major grocers have remained constant for over 5 years, as verified by auditors. In most cases, same-store sales growth has fallen below our national food inflation rate as well. Some experts, including recent committee witnesses, have made claims that grocers are consistently reporting record profits, which may create sensational headlines. However, it is crucial to understand that due to inflation, companies should naturally report higher profits in nominal dollars each year. Accusations of profiteering in this context are unwarranted distractions. To address real issues, we must put the profiteering debate to rest. One significant concern we've identified is the prevailing culture of copycatting, price coordination, and discount alignment with the grocery sector. An example of this is when Loblaw decided to discontinue its 50% discount policy, citing a need to align discounts with competitors. Additionally, practices like the so-called 3-month blackout period, where grocers request suppliers to freeze prices, can impact retail prices. Metro CEO Eric Laflèche has acknowledged that some food prices will rise in February due to the end of the price freeze, leading to increased price volatility, which is contrary to the desired outcome for Canadians. The ongoing bread price scandal, with 3 companies admitting guilt for their participation after nearly 9 years, is unacceptable. The Competition Bureau should take a more proactive role in monitoring potentially anti-competitive behavior. And lastly, I understand that this committee has already heard extensively about the importance of implementing a mandatory industry-led code of conduct. We cannot stress enough how crucial this step is. Mr. Galen Weston recent testimony before the holidays, where he may have misconstrued how the code operates in Australia and its potential cost to Canadians, needs clarification. The implementation of the Code of Conduct should be viewed as a priority if this committee is serious about achieving long-term food price stability, as highlighted in Canada's Food Price Report 2024. Thank you for allowing us to present these recommendations, and I look forward to engaging in a productive discussion on these pressing matters. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charlebois and Ms. Taylor. We'll now turn to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Mr. Curry, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm very pleased to be back in front of the committee today and seeing some very familiar faces. And for those of you who do not know me, as the Chair mentioned in his opening remarks, I am Keith Curry, and I am the President of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and we represent 190,000 farmers and farm families from coast to coast to coast here in Canada. And I'm also joined online by my Executive Director at CFA, Scott Ross, who will answer all the hard questions for you today. You know, we have all experienced in the recent years where food inflation has outpaced an already high inflationary pressures on the cost of living. And while the rate of food inflation has declined over the past year, it's understandably a topic that's of great concern to all Canadians. And as part of my remarks here today, really what I want to do is to cover off what I believe are some misperceptions when it comes to this topic. The first one is, as the price of food increases, so do farmers' profits. In fact, it costs a lot more to produce the food we eat today than it did before the pandemic. For example, when you look at the change in price of many of our farm inputs out there, whether you're talking about machinery, fuel, fertilizer, livestock feed, the prices that farmers pay have increased nearly 40% between 2019 and today. While farm incomes have also increased during this period, according to the most recent Statistics Canada numbers, the growth in expenses outpaced the rise in farm cash receipts. Looking ahead, while we are starting to see a softening of commodity prices in the market, the price of farm inputs is still staying at a high level. Misperception number 2 is that farm gate prices drive retail prices. A recent study conducted by the Agriculture Producers Association of Saskatchewan revealed that underlying commodity does not account for the entire price increase of the final food product. More often than not, it plays a minor role with the farm share of retail prices for the product sampled averaging less than a quarter of the value of the final product. While I would stress that the evidence is quite clear that farm gate prices play a minor role in retail price increases, there are some immediate steps that can be taken to reduce the rising costs involved in Canadian food production. First, we need time-limited and targeted exemptions for on-farm use of natural gas and propane that we were trying to accomplish through Bill C-234. These exemptions must be available not just for grain drying, but for heating and cooling of barns, greenhouses, and other production facilities. Based on our survey of the impact of Canada's carbon tax on livestock, crop, and greenhouse farms across Canada, we are seeing the carbon tax account for up to 40% of total energy bills in some sectors. Second, we have put forward a number of recommendations in our budget submission of 2024 this year that would help drive down the cost of production and improve supply chain dynamics in the agriculture sector. For example, we're calling on the government to consult on and develop a critical farm input strategy similar to the critical mineral strategy to ensure that Canadian producers have a long-term stable source of supply for critical farm inputs to produce high-quality agriculture and agri-food products. And finally, we need to move forward with implementation of an industry-led grocery sector code of conduct. The objective of the code of conduct is to enable a thriving industry to promote trust, fair dealing, and collaboration throughout the value chain, increase commercial certainty, and develop an effective and equitable dispute resolution process. While not targeting food inflation, it will help improve supply chain dynamics. Industry has committed considerable time and resources into the development of an industry-led code that works for all parties. We have greatly appreciated the attention and support of FPT governments throughout the development of the code and hope to see that support continue in getting this over the line. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have. And just of note, this Friday, February 9th, is actually Food Freedom Day, and that is the day when the average Canadian has made enough income to pay for the groceries for the entire year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curry. We'll now move to Ms. Brisebois or Mr. Littler. Okay, Mr. Littler, over to you for up to 5 minutes for Retail Council. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members, for the invitation to appear once again at this committee. With your permission, RCC will split our time. I will speak to food inflation, its causes and current trajectory, and Deanne Brisebois, our CEO, will speak briefly to the Code of Conduct, which we know to be of interest. In a different context, Al Gore referred to an inconvenient truth, meaning facts that some people would rather not acknowledge, because once acknowledged, they'd have to do something they'd rather not do. In this case, what some political opportunists would rather not do is acknowledge how very little grocers have to do with food price inflation, and admit that the overwhelming portion of the run-up in food prices occurs earlier in the supply chain, at the producer and processor level. This is not to lay the blame on producers or most of the processors. As earlier noted, growers have faced huge pressures on input costs like feed, fuel, and fertilizer, being global phenomena, along with rising interest charges, labor, and other costs. These costs are passed on to manufacturers, who then bear additional costs of their own. But the fact remains that almost 80% of the price of food on grocery shelves arises at the vendor level, long before reaching grocers. That inconvenient truth also includes the fact that Canada's food inflation rate is the second lowest in the G7, the fact that the most recent food inflation rate in Canada is less than half what it was when RCC last appeared before this committee, and that the delta between food inflation and headline CPI inflation has narrowed by more than half, almost two-thirds in fact. And lastly, the fact that gross margins and net profits in the grocery sector are consistently within the 2% to 5% range, profit percentages that are dwarfed by the profits of the big global CPG manufacturers who have been passing on repeated cost increases. Notwithstanding those facts, that inconvenient truth, we face recurring attempts to portray grocers as cartoon villains, and in service of that false narrative, a deliberate avoidance of any effort to hold the earlier players in the chain accountable. Our political leadership owes it to Canadians to give them the full picture about food inflation and to openly acknowledge its global and supply chain causes, and frankly to stop scapegoating a grocery industry that continues to work diligently to help stabilize food prices for Canadians. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Ms. Brisebois.
Merci, Carl.
Thank you, Carla. Creating a grocery store code of conduct led by the industry is a colossal task. There's a lot of work that remains to be done. The steering committee that we are a part of is encouraged by the progress that we have made thus far. A grocery store code of conduct is not a unique document. It is a group of integrated measures that work together in order to promote fair trading and ethical trading, as well as contract certitude. It is also important to note that this code is different from codes that exist in other countries. The one that is proposed in Canada is reciprocal, and it includes all actors, so small, medium, large businesses throughout the supply chain. Some big companies in our industry have indicated that they have certain concerns with regards to the current code, but we trust that our industry will be able to come to a resolution and consensus, which we hope will answer the concerns of concerned parties. We are currently discussing with various companies in order to come to a consensus and agreement that will respect everyone's needs. We look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Beaucoup, Madame Brisebois. Et maintenant, nous avons le temps pour les questions. Premièrement.
Thank you, Ms. Brisebois. Time for questions. Now, Ms. Rude, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, witnesses, for being with us today, again, on this important study. And you've all mentioned the Grocery Code of Conduct and very different facets. So first off, Mr. Curry, could you tell this committee, if this is implemented, how this is going to work to protect farmers and producers and those who supply the retail chains? Because I think what most people are missing is, and we heard this today, is it's actually to help the farmers. It may not have an impact on food prices at the grocery store shelves. But could you explain to us how this will affect the prices?
I'm going to turn it over after a couple of comments of mine to my colleague, Scott, who's online. Scott has been very intimate in the process of the Grocery Code of Conduct development. But certainly what we're looking for is integrity in the system to make sure that people are playing fairly. We all know that businesses up and down the supply chain need to be profitable in order to continue to exist. But there are, I can name you off certain instances, and your colleague, Mr. Epp, who will be here later, lives in an area that is surrounded by greenhouse growers. And it's not uncommon for a greenhouse production facility to have a shipment ready to go. And when the truck shows up, they say, "Oh, by the way, you're getting 5 cents less a carton." We want to put that stability and make sure that what people are saying they actually do. So that's just reassurance for farmers that they can count on that price stability. So Scott, I don't know if you want to add any more to this. You've been very involved.
I think that
in
answers
this.
my question.
That's good.
Mr.
Okay.
Curry.
Sure.
And continuing with the Grocery Code of Conduct, perhaps Ms. Brisbois or Mr. Littler, back in December. We had some of the grocery retailers here, and it's my understanding that your organization represents some of the grocers, including Sobeys and Metro, as well as Loblaws and Walmart. And Loblaw and Walmart are the only two of the big five grocers who are holding out and have yet to sign on to the Grocery Code of Conduct right now. And I asked this question to the Loblaw CEO when he appeared before this committee before Christmas. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, where does the Retail Council of Canada stand on the issue of supply for independent grocers?
We support it. In fact, I share with your executive director a seat on the steering committee, which is now the interim board for the Code of Conduct. So we are supportive. We understand, though, as I noted in my remarks, that this is an unusual code because it is the only one that includes everybody. So if we look at the UK code or the Australian code, it's focused very much on the large grocers and the manufacturers. In Canada, we came together and said, if we're going to talk about fair practice, transparency, contractual certainty, it's got to be right across the supply chain. So it's normal that it's taken time. It's normal that some of the players have concerns around some of the elements of the code. But I can assure you that from Retail Council's perspective, we're working very hard with those who have concerns to try to respond to them and to bring everybody under the umbrella, because we think it would be a very important sign to show that the entire food supply chain is working together for Canadians.
Thank you. Mr. Charlebois, in your food price report 2023, it mentions overall food prices will rise by 5 to 7% this year, and a family of four will see their grocery bills rise by over $1,000 in 2024. And your report references higher production costs, which we've heard from Mr. Curry. Farmers and producers are facing higher in production costs, and higher transportation costs will impact the price of food. And this is a direct quote from your report that, quote, may be passed on to the consumer as producers try to remain profitable. And a large part of production is fuel prices for trucks that transport our food. They have to pay carbon tax. And we see that the NDP Liberal government wants to quadruple the carbon tax, which will make, and in fact, it's going to go up on April 1st. So given that carbon tax inevitably is going to increase the cost to transport goods to the grocery store, do you believe it's going to have a direct impact on Canadian families and will be a reason for higher food prices that we'll see on the grocery store shelves coming up?
Good question. First of all, I want to just briefly correct you. That was last year's report. This year's report, 2024, we're expecting food prices to go up by 2.5 to 4.5%. For a family of four, it's $700. So things are improving, if you will. 2023 was a very difficult year for sure. When it comes to the carbon tax, we've done some studies at the lab. We can't correlate what's happening with the carbon tax with food prices at retail. However, and I did actually mention this at the Finance Committee, I think it was 3 months ago, we are concerned about competitiveness because the financial burden put on farmers, on processing, on retailers. Eventually, we expect that the industry's competitiveness could be compromised over time compared to what we're seeing in the United States.
Thank you. And I mentioned the 2023 report because we did see a huge increase in 2023 when we had the implementation of the carbon tax, and it was going to rise prices in 2023. So being 2024, I can't see how that wouldn't pertain to 2024, and that's why I directly quoted that. So yes, in 2024 we said $700, but that's still a significant amount of money for Canadian families, and we see record numbers at food banks right now, over 2 million people. So we're trying to find ways to lower the cost of food for Canadians, but it seems this government's policies and input costs is a huge part, again, of the cost of food for producers.
Very briefly, what I recommend to FIN, to the Department of, to the Committee of Finance, is to pause the carbon tax for all companies related to the food industry overall, because we don't know exactly how the carbon tax will impact the industry's competitiveness over time. We just don't know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charlebois. Ms. Rood, we'll now turn to Ms. Taylor-Roy for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think I may stay with that line of questioning because you said, Mr. Charlebois, that you cannot correlate food costs with the carbon tax. And in fact, the carbon tax is higher this year than it was last year. It's been going up by a certain amount, predictably, for investments every year. So how do you explain then if it's being caused by the carbon, or how do you explain then this year it will be a 2.5 to 4.5% increase, whereas last year it was a lot more, if in fact the carbon tax is going up and not down?
Yeah, so the rhetoric around the carbon tax is a bit misleading. Most people are talking about retail, but a lot of things can happen at retail. Consumer behavior can impact food prices. The weather can impact food prices. So it's very difficult to correlate retail prices with policies such as the carbon tax. But what we've looked at is our industrial prices. And what we're finding out is that industrial prices in Canada, so up the food chain from farm to processing, the gap between Canada's IPPI and the US's PPI is increasing, which means that we could compromise Canada's food security over time if we don't necessarily allow the food industry to adapt and adopt green technologies to decrease the industry's carbon footprint. We need to decarbonize the economy, obviously, and I think everyone agrees with that. It's the pace to which we're doing it right now, imposing this tax. What we're seeing is that perhaps the industry is overburdened by that.
Thank you.
Yep.
And obviously, the United States doesn't have a carbon price across the country, but we know that many of the states do have equivalent to a carbon price. And we also realize that a lot of the trade agreements are going to be including some kind of carbon pricing in there. So you talk about a competitiveness, but with the prospect of tariffs being implied if you do not have a carbon pricing program in place, is that not also a competitive concern for Canada?
I think we need to. My personal opinion is that I think we need to be in lockstep with our trading partners because we could actually really hurt. I think we are hurting farmers. I think Bill C-234 was not welcome news for the farming community, and I'm sure that Mr. Curry would actually speak to that for sure. I think we need to think about processing. A lot of processors are suffering, and RCC did mention that costs are going up in retail and distribution, which is absolutely true. Yeah. Now we're seeing more investment in the middle mile, Metro, Loblaws, they're all investing in the middle mile, which is great, but it's happening really fast.
Okay. So it's the speed of the change is what you're referring to.
Yep.
Very good. And have you done any work looking at the impact of climate events in Canada on food costs? And I'm talking about anywhere in the chain, particularly, obviously, the farmers. But the droughts we've had recently, obviously the flooding, forest fires. Have you had any kind of estimates done on what that is adding to food costs or to farmers?
Well, I mean, every year when we actually write Canada's food price report, climate change is the number one factor. It's the wild card. For a few years, it was COVID and climate change. Yeah. Now it's really, climate change is really a big factor. It's not necessarily, it doesn't mean that it will drive prices higher. It's just it makes things more unpredictable. And I think the focus of this committee to look at food price stability is to look at price volatility and not necessarily food inflation. We need inflation to grow the economy. So to demonize inflation, to me, is a waste of time. We need to focus more on price volatility, and climate change certainly does that.
Increase the volatility, right. You said that climate change would not necessarily drive prices higher.
Not always, no.
But if they're not going to lower prices, obviously, like droughts, floods, things like that, when we're...
I mean, sometimes environmental conditions are favorable to production. We do see that. I mean,
has there been an occurrence of that in the last 5 years in Canada?
And well, we can't forget that we're doing a lot of research to help farmers grow more. Yields are going up and all that, so we need that research to continue. And so, in lockstep to what's happening with climate change, we've actually been supportive of the industry to cope with climate change overall.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do I have?
You still have about a minute if you'd like to use it.
Oh, I do. Great. Yes, then I would love to go to Stacey Taylor and ask about that question of volatility. I saw something about food prices being calmer next year. Perhaps you could comment on that and why you think that is the case.
Absolutely. So when we are doing our forecast, what we're essentially using is all of the available information at the time. We run all sorts of different scenarios so that we can try to predict what is going to happen. Because we have a lot of unknown unknowns, to borrow from a well-known phrase, we try to estimate what could possibly happen along with the data that has actually already happened. And so that's how we're creating our food price predictions for next year, and we always have. Now, one thing that we do have a challenge with is that we have limited Statistics Canada data. And so, for example, when we're looking at the North, we have information for the Northwest Territories for food. We have information for the Yukon for food. We have nothing for none of it. But it is also very limited. And so if it's going to be on a Canada-wide basis, it really does need to include all of Canada. The North is a very important part of our country. And we need to have much more visibility in terms of what the challenges that they are facing versus the rest of Canada.
Okay,
great. That's good to know. Thank you.
All right, maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes.
Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We appreciate you being available. Mr. Charlebois, I'll start with you. You mentioned that according to your analysis and your studies, to say that major grocery stores are being abusive with regards to their profits is not accurate. Can you explain what you mean and your logic? How does that explain the big profits? It's very easy to believe what we see. Indeed, the Retail Council of Canada, I agree with them. This issue was politicized. In order to politicize it, big numbers were used in dollars. And then there were some reports on greedflation. The profit margins have been actually the same for the past 5 years. We think that this is an important measure to look at, because when we talk about costs in the supply chain, that's a very clear indication. Here's the other thing. There's an increase of food sales because food is not the same as pharmaceutical and cosmetics. The increase of food sales rarely goes above food inflation. It has happened with Metro and Loblaws, but it's very rare. So these companies actually make a lot of money by selling things other than food. Here's what we've been told as parliamentarians. We've actually not been able to have the numbers, and so we're asking these companies to give these numbers to the Competition Bureau. They say yes, and then we find out that they haven't actually provided the numbers. Some are more transparent than others. I am being a little bit liberal with my comments here, but I'm glad that you talked about the Competition Bureau. I'd like to hear you speak to the Minister of Industry's latest comments in the media. He's asked the grocery store CEOs to come back to talk to us, but we've already spoken to them. Do you think that that would have an impact, since you study these numbers on a daily basis? I accompanied Minister Champagne to a meeting with the 5 CEOs in October in Ottawa. I was invited and I was asked to make a presentation. I talked about important things like the code of conduct, the infamous blackout period, and I think these are obsolete practices in my opinion. There is a culture of price fixing in the industry, in my opinion, that needs to be fixed. We saw it for bread. We might be able to do this with other vectors as well. But I don't hear this in the general message. The minister talks about reduflation, dequalification, and these kinds of things. But I think we need to go past that. With regards to profits, we're not really fixing the problem. I didn't make this graph. Well, I made this graph. I didn't talk about it earlier, but this demonstrates clearly that the prices are more volatile between November and February, and that has been the case for 30 years. We did a 5, 10, 15, 20, 30-year analysis. For 30 years, between November, January, and February have been very volatile. The month of May is volatile because of fees. I have a letter from Loblaws that I included in my report right here. It announces to the suppliers that as of 28th of April, the fees will increase. What do you think is going to happen? Well, the prices are going to increase. Producers will increase their prices in order to compensate for these increased fees, and the consumer will have to pay for that. You're going exactly in the direction that I want you to go, that I want to go in. With regards to the code of conduct, there's a percentage, a margin percentage, and if there's no abuse, for example, everybody has to participate in this effort. And I'd like to hear you talk about that. We have the information that we've been given, and what we get the impression is that Walmart and Loblaws don't want to sign the code, and that they represent about 50% of the market. What will the impact be if we have a code of conduct and half the market doesn't agree with it? How do we remedy that? In my opinion, there is no debate. The code will not work without the mandatory participation of all of the players in the industry. I can't see this code working without Loblaws and Walmart. We'll need a bit of leadership from provinces and from the federal government. I don't see how it can work. It's better not to not have a code if Loblaws and Walmart won't be participating. You don't see a scenario where some players would join later? No. Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all of our witnesses for coming before us. Mr. Littler, I'd like to start with you. Now, I understand, we come to different conclusions on the nature of profits in the retail grocery sector. But I wanted to talk about, I think in your opening statement, you had used the word demonization of the industry and the fact that sometimes a cartoon caricature is used to describe grocery retailers. It says that you are the Vice President of Public Affairs, and the theme of my question is I think those characterizations practically invite themselves. If you look at the industry, the big three in particular, if you look at the companies that they hold, many of those are companies that used to be competitors and they swallowed them up. So there's a definite lack of competition in the market. Dr. Charlebois talked about the culture in the industry. We know the bread price fixing. We know the recent deals between Loblaw and Manulife. They've had to climb back down from that. The fact that the Loblaws also reduced the discounts that people were getting on same-day items and so on. The fact that employees have had to go on strike because they can't afford to shop at the very places they work. I'm just wondering, though, do you think the grocery retail industry needs to take on a little bit of responsibility for the public image out there, the perception that exists? This didn't just come about in a vacuum.
Well, there are a number of things I would say. First, I would take issue with your characterization that it's not a highly competitive industry. But the second thing I would say is that we have had a situation in which politicians of a number of stripes, some of them very senior, and some of the punditry, and particularly some of the media, have made an attempt to tie in the public mind the profits of grocers with the food inflation that people are experiencing when they go to the stores. And that is an entirely unfounded basis. And there are those who have, through this piece, frankly, suppressed information with respect to the more general contribution. And I would say that this committee in its report showed a significantly greater amount of balance. But when it comes to the Twitterverse, or when it comes to some of the political statements at press conferences, there is a deliberate attempt repeatedly to try and tie food inflation to grocery operations, grocery profits. And as
I understand that, but the basis of my question was on, do you think grocers need to take a little bit of responsibility for well-documented public actions on their part? The question was, this perception didn't just occur in a vacuum.
Well, first, I think if you treat each issue discreetly, I think it is reasonable that you can have a discussion about these issues. What I'm taking issue with, and what I think, those who work in the grocery industry take issue with, is the deliberate characterization of grocers by a number of political leaders as being responsible for food inflation, when all of the evidence is that that is not the case, that expert bodies, including the Bank of Canada, Statistics Canada, have been very clear with commentators, and notwithstanding that, they have made repeated attempts to link grocery operations, grocery business decisions, and grocery profits to food inflation when that is a spurious connection.
Dr. Charlebois, on the same subject, because you did make mention of the culture that exists, and Loblaw has certainly had its feet raked over the coals publicly, and the recent decision where they were going to reduce the discounts available on same-day sales from 50% to 30%. I think, what do you? Can you just expand a little bit more on the culture? Because, to me, it appears that this company just simply is unable to read the room, and that there's a certain amount of tone deafness with respect to its public relations.
I certainly share your concern. The 50% discount became news because we actually emailed Loblaw ourselves in January, because we were hearing rumors. So we basically emailed Loblaw, is this true? Is the 50% discount policy ending at Loblaw? And they confirmed that it was actually being rolled out as of January 14th or something. So I said, I asked them permission to post the email on Twitter, on X. And I asked them what the reason is. And they basically said that they wanted to align their policy along with competitors. And to me, it raised many red flags, and for two reasons. One, they disclosed openly what they were doing. And two, Loblaw allowed me to post the email on social media without even thinking how people would actually perceive the message itself. So again, I've been following the industry for 25 years. Time and time again, I've been reminded of some of the issues. The blackout period shouldn't exist. There's no reason to have a blackout period. And Éric Laflèche himself agreed that prices do go up in February, and our data actually shows that too. So every time there's some shenanigans up the food chain that's going on, consumers end up paying for it.
I think that takes me close. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor, for giving that 15 seconds back to the committee. I'll go to Mr. Barlow for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Charlebois, I just want you to clarify one of your comments that on Bill C-234, you said farmers weren't happy about that but I think you meant the amendments that were added to 234. Do you mind just clarifying that really quick for the committee?
The amendments, absolutely. The spirit of the bill, of course, was important, but the amendments were not good news.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that was clear on the record.
Yeah.
I just saw Mr. Curry's eyes get all red. And
yeah, it gets complicated.
Yeah,
you know?
no, I get it. Today, the innovation minister, when talking at a media conference regarding food prices, said we are taking some lessons from the European Union, which concerns me with that comment. And I just wanted to direct to a column that you wrote called "Farmers' Breaking Point," and you commented about what's going on in Europe with the demonstrations from farmers in France and Germany and other countries, and you specifically talked about taxes, regulations, unscience-based decisions on pesticides and inputs. Can you maybe comment if Canada continues to go down this road, what could be the impact on the economic viability of farming in Canada and related to fewer farmers, food prices and food security?
Absolutely. Yeah, I wrote that piece because Europe, I think, is sending us a message. I mean, this could actually happen eventually in Canada if we continue to not listen to price takers. Farmers do not control anything. They're very vulnerable. They need to be heard. And most importantly, they need to be understood. And I think a lot of policies are out there are driven by urban centricism, if you will. I mean, there are variety. In the column, I actually do mention quite a few examples of some of the things that we've seen in recent years. But right now, farmers are seen as part of a problem. Yeah. And if you don't have farmers, you don't have food, you don't have cities. And I think we've kind of forgotten about that a little bit. And it's really more about understanding farming. People love farmers, but they question farming.
Yeah. Thanks for that. You also made a comment criticizing the Bank of Canada's claims on the carbon tax's impact on inflation. And now the Bank of Canada is claiming that removing the carbon tax would actually lead to a 0.6% drop in the inflation rate, meaning at the time, and I think this was in October, the fall, that the inflation at 3.8%, that the carbon tax is responsible for 16% of that and that interest rate number. Maybe some background on why your comments on that and maybe your position on what your thoughts are on the carbon tax and the impact on inflation.
Yeah, so we had interactions with the Bank of Canada on how they calculated the 0.15 percentage. They only looked at three components of the CPI, excluding food. And so I thought it was a very simplistic calculation. In fact, I posted, again, with their permission, I posted their calculation on X. And I think a lot of people were surprised by the simplicity of the arithmetic by the Bank of Canada. Again, that's why I'm recommending a pause on the carbon tax for the entire food industry, from farm gate to store and restaurants, because nobody, including the Bank of Canada, understands how this policy could compromise Canada's food security over time.
Thanks for that. I wanted to shift to Mr. Curry, and you mentioned that number that some of your members are saying that how important 234 is, that 40% of their energy bills is carbon taxes, and we've certainly had bills from across Canada that are showing that in some cases the carbon tax is actually more than the natural gas that they are paying for. By increasing the carbon tax again on April 1st and quadrupling this tax over the next few years, what impact is this having on the financial health of farming in Canada, and why is 234 so important?
Well, as you mentioned, the single biggest cost we have around our in particular heating fuels is carbon tax. One of our board members who resides just outside of Ottawa here, and I think many of you probably heard from him, operates Carlton Mushrooms, and he's going to be paying $450,000 just in carbon tax alone next year. How do you make a business case when you're paying that kind of money? And where the impact is going to hit is farmers are going to have to make a decision. And that decision is going to be, I'm going to have to cut back on my production, or maybe I quit altogether. And that's when you're going to start to see the impact on the food supply, which inevitably will have an impact on the price. We may be able to replace that supply, but it's going to be at a much greater cost because it's not produced here in Canada. It's going to come from elsewhere. And as Dr. Charlebois mentioned, I mean, we are price takers. We don't get to set that price for our product for the most part. It's based on international markets. So we have to absorb all those costs, and we can only absorb so much until there's a breaking point.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. We'll now turn to Mr. McDonald online for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to go directly to Mr. Curry. Mr. Curry, I just, and you mentioned it a little bit, we've heard many examples of acrimonious retail supplier relationships in the absence of such a code. I'm just wondering how that relationship, or can you explain the present role of that relationship right now in some of the prices of food on the shelves in grocery stores?
Well, most of our farmers don't have direct contact with the end retailer. It's more prevalent in the horticulture sector in particular, where there may be some direct contracting with the big grocers, so to speak. And from time to time, they will be affected if all of a sudden the contract that was signed isn't honored. Somebody's going to offer them less money, or they'll drive to the next laneway. And so that's why this code of conduct, the concept of a code of conduct, is appealing to farmers, so that we have, you know, the security, the transparency, and the good business accolades through the entire supply chain, and that we actually are rewarded for what we do. Because when farmers are profitable, the money doesn't go in their pocket; it gets reinvested in their businesses, like all small businesses. So it's good for the economy, and that economic development piece often gets lost in some of these conversations.
Thank you. And I just want to flip to a little bit. Ms. Watt talked about tariffs. Last year, the U.S. enacted the most significant climate policy to date. And over the past year, a mix of Republicans and Democrats, which they don't always agree on, as we know, have echoed a push for measuring greenhouse gas emissions from certain products produced in the U.S. They hope the data will underpin a creation of a tariff on imports of carbon-intensive goods from other countries. We know there's a former president running that used it as a geopolitical weapon. We know the European Union is also implementing or contemplating implementing carbon tariffs on those countries without a recognized carbon pricing mechanism. So we're in a position, if we don't provide a carbon pricing mechanism, our trading partners start enacting tariffs. Like, what preparation are we presently preparing for in regards to some of these issues that could happen relatively quickly? In some cases, they are happening now. Mr. Curry, do you have any opinion on that?
It's a very complex subject matter, and we've heard comments already this morning about international trade deals and carbon pricing, and it's true that carbon border adjustments are going to become a real thing very shortly. Those conversations are happening all the time around trade deals, and certainly with the ministerial conference coming up at the end of this month, that will certainly be a big part of what's on the agenda. But with respect to what's going on in the United States, it was also referenced here today. Our farmers are dealing at a competitive disadvantage because there's a lot of programs out there that are financially supporting the farmers in the U.S. It's not that, I mean, our farmers can get angry about it, but the reality is their government's looking after their farmers in a financial way much better than our own government is. And I think that's where we struggle in the competitiveness of producing our products. We can grow products with the best of them on a level playing field, but it's when we have differences of opinions or policies across borders that affect how we are going to have to farm, or if we can farm, that's where we struggle.
So basically, preparation, I mean, relevant to carbon tariffs, do you feel that this is going to be enacted? Like, what preparation should governments be doing now? Besides, I know there was a 25% increase in the budget in agriculture. Maybe that's, in difference of opinion, not enough, obviously. But I want to know, what are we doing as an industry and sectors to prepare for the likes of situations where tariffs are going to be imposed on some of our products? And we hear the conversations around do away with carbon pricing, do away with carbon mechanisms altogether in Canada. But I don't believe that's the way the world is going. So I want to know for my farmers in my riding to be able to talk to them directly and say, here's what we need to be doing. So I guess I'm trying to throw it back at you to say, what should we be telling government officials as ourselves, the department, moving forward, our trade partners? Where are we at?
I think what's very frustrating from my perspective is nobody comes and talks to us before they put policies in place. And it's not that farmers don't want to do the right thing or get to the right place on climate discussions or on carbon pricing, but we're never given the opportunity to have meaningful input or work with the government of the day to create that right regulatory framework where we accomplish the ability to put an effective pricing on carbon without hurting the farmer. Let's not forget the two most important things to human beings are food and shelter. And food security is going to trump carbon pricing every day. And I hope we just don't leave it too late.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I could
Thank you, Chair.
briefly add to that. I don't know if I have a moment. I would just add the other point that we as farm organizations are working internationally with our counterparts on the need to ensure there's appropriate disciplines at the WTO to ensure that all of those measures are implemented in a science-based fashion and that we have consistent grounds through which they're being developed. And I think from our perspective, that is absolutely paramount. If we're going to see mechanisms like that employed, that there has to be international legal frameworks that hold those accountable to the science and ensure they're being built around a real strong basis of science and evidence.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ross. And I can remember I was a minister here of trade at locally, and I can remember when the former president, Mr. Trump, superseded the WTO on those issues that you're talking directly about. So it'll, I think we need to be prepared. Thank you.
Thanks, Heath. Okay, we'll now turn to Mr. Parent for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Brisebois, I'd like to follow up on my previous questions. In your introduction, you mentioned that you have had discussions with 2 of your members. You said that you're optimistic. Do you think that you will manage to get everybody to sign on to the code? And if it doesn't happen, do you think that you would implement it regardless? Inaudible for the interpreter. We are planning around a commitment from and with all of the stakeholders. From the beginning, I've said that this is a huge undertaking because we are including everyone. We expected that some stakeholders might have some concerns. The committee's or the steering committee's objective is to try to find solutions in order to increase our chances of including all of the important companies and major companies around the code of conduct in order to sign it. So the first goal is to find a solution. Some were concerned that the code of conduct might become more diluted or less efficient. Is there any basis in that? That's a great point, because one of the big challenges is that many organizations feel that this is a code that should resemble the one in England. Others feel that it should be a voluntary code and reciprocal one. Even if we're talking about 2 companies or 1 company, there are many groups that have shared their concerns. Here's what I'd like to say. It's not just about retailers. There are many concerns, so there is a lot of work to do going forward. Therefore, there will be many meetings in the coming months in order to try to find a solution that is satisfactory to all stakeholders. Thank you very much. On to Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Charlebois, much has been made of this committee about carbon pricing, And, you know, with respect to Mr. Curry's intervention on C234, I think the provisions of that bill are in line with the exemptions that are already in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. You can already see exemptions for farming machinery, farm fuels, and farming activity. But, you know, if you look at, like you were talking about volatility, now the price is set per liter, but of course we've seen extreme volatility in the price of diesel fuel. I think in 2022, you know, in British Columbia, some regions were seeing a price of around $2.30 per liter. Now we're at a stage where I think it's around an average of $1.70. So there's extreme volatility in the price per diesel. That's very important because it's a transport fuel. I worry, though, that the state of our discourse is doing a disservice to the overall problem when there's just too much of a focus just on carbon pricing. We know oil and gas companies have certainly seen their bank accounts do very well in recent years, and there's incredible volatility on this on a fuel source. Is there anything more you can add on that area of price volatility? I know you're, you know, on the question of the price per fuels. Is that something that we need to pay a little bit more attention to in a holistic way?
I assume you're talking about price volatility at retail, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we don't see any immediate volatility due to carbon pricing in Canada. In fact, if you look at months when the tax actually goes up, so in April, May, June, there's actually little volatility. So we don't see the evidence of that. But like I said, over time, over several years, we could actually force companies to see their costs increase and become less competitive. And this is something that, because we do have access to firm level data, we can't share, unfortunately, for obvious reasons. But we do see some companies struggle financially a lot more because of the low margins. You're referring to the petroleum industry. Margins, I'm sure you know, are much more significant than in the food industry. From farm gate to plate, margins are extremely low. So the carbon pricing policy can have a huge impact on an industry where margins are incredibly slim.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Colleagues, I'm just going to exercise 2 or 3 minutes while we have our witnesses here. To the folks at Retail Council of Canada, like how much longer do you think, I'm not trying to be facetious, but this has been a process now that is, what, a year and a half in the making around the Code of Conduct, maybe even longer. We've heard from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and Mr. Charlebois that this is a really important mechanism. We sit around the table as parliamentarians, and at some point, if industry can't get itself together and figure out what that pathway is, there is going to be increasingly a pressure just for us to mandate and legislate a code ourselves. How much longer do you think is reasonable for us as parliamentarians to give before we should actually move forward and maybe legislate this?
It's difficult to answer that question, Mr. Chairman. I think there is good faith in the different companies and organizations that have voiced some concerns or that need clarification. I think that we are all working towards the development and launch of a code of conduct, and we need to ensure that there are no unintended consequences. In fact, we've been working on this since early 2021, and I can't tell you how many meetings I've attended, so there's a lot of work. We are obviously, when we reported to the FPT ministers, we were hoping to launch the code at some point in 2024. We continue to be optimistic that that will be the case.
Can I ask, we had Mr. Weston before our committee here in before Christmas. I'm not as concerned as a member of Parliament about whether or not PepsiCo or Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble have a certain provision that they can rely on. They are big enough players in the market to be able to have that commercial battle with the Loblaws and the Empires and the Metros of the world. What I'm concerned about is my small and medium-sized businesses in King's Hants that are saying this is really important. We know it's not going to be a silver bullet, but we need some type of provisions that we can rely upon in instances where we think that there's almost unfair dealing. Do you, Retail Council of Canada, see a world where you would exempt large multinationals that may not need the protection of a grocery code of conduct, but you would actually move for SMEs that maybe this is an important mechanism for some transparency and element?
maybe I should suggest that you join our steering committee.
Maybe I'll have to.
It's an interesting concept. There's absolutely no question that the large corporations can negotiate. The issue is very much to protect the entire supply chain. I think my colleague here talked about small farmers, small processors, wholesalers, small retailers. Those are definitely, they are extremely important to the health of the code. We're not at a stage, though, Mr. Chairman, where we would exclude anybody, but that may be a discussion we should consider.
Well, I think this committee, as Mr. Charlebois has said, and I think it's not a partisan element. I think that all parties are starting to get to the point that if we can't find that pathway, there will be increasingly pressure from the opposition, indeed from the backbenches of our Liberal caucus, to say, let's get on with it then. And I know that's complicated in terms of how that plays out across the provinces, but that would be the sentiment that I see around this committee and indeed around Parliament Hill. Just very quickly, Mr. Charlebois, to you. What do you see? You mentioned Europe. You mentioned regulatory burden and some of the challenges and how farmers are protesting. I thought Mr. McDonald had an interesting line of questioning where you're starting to see this idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm one of the folks that would suggest that if we don't start accounting for that, there's only so much that we can ask our own domestic industry to bear in terms of pricing before we do become uncompetitive, to the point that you were making. What's your sense in what's happening in Europe and some of what the Biden administration is seeing? Do we think there's a pathway in the future where that starts to become part of the trading mechanism of how we move agricultural products around the world, and where would Canada benefit in that? Like, our industry is quite sustainable. I see a world that if that accounts for, we could actually be in a strong footing.
Yeah, I would say that, decarbonizing our agri-food economy can become a competitive advantage over time. Now, how we do it, I think, is up for debate, obviously. But I'm more of a, I'm more of a carrot believer than a stick believer, to be honest. I think we need a mixture of both. Right now, all we see, and I would say probably the industry is seeing it stick, and so I think we need both.
So just quickly on that, offset protocols, and these are conversations. This will be the last thing I ask. I don't want to test my colleagues too far, but how important is it for things like ECCC to be able to move on offset protocols where farmers can actually see some revenue coming in for their sustainable practices? This carrot versus stick element.
Mm-hmm.
What would your recommendation be to the government to move more on that protocol so farmers see both sides of this ledger as opposed to seeing it just as a potential threat?
Yes, absolutely. My colleague Stacey Taylor mentioned earlier the importance of collecting data, good data. This is something we're missing in Canada. To create a dialogue, to get everyone on board about an issue as important as the environment, you need data. And right now, there's little of it. There's a huge data deficit in Canada to understand, carbon emissions, who's doing what are the implications over time. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that needs to stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the quick indulgence, colleagues. That brings us to the end of our first panel. Thank you very much to Dr. Charlebois, Ms. Taylor, Mr. Curry, and Mr. Ross, and Ms. Brisebois, and Mr. Littler. So thank you so much. We're going to pause just for a few minutes, and we'll bring in our second panel. Meeting suspended. things shifted around from the last panel. But welcome back. We got to keep moving. And we've got our second panel up, and we've got 3 more great witnesses from Carleton University at the Sprott School of Business, Dr. Ian Lee. From the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, we have Tyler McCann. And from Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, Marcus Jansen. So, Mr. Lee, you are online. I'm going to give you up to 5 minutes to start. We're going to get right at it. Over to you. You're on mute, my friend. There you go.
Thank you. Sorry, my fault. My apologies. First, thank you, Chair. First, my disclosures. I don't belong to or donate money to any political party. Secondly, I'm a tenured prof paid by Carleton for 37 years teaching the strategy capstone course that evaluates competitiveness and value creation of industries and firms. I do not consult to anybody anywhere. Thirdly, immediately after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I taught from March 91 until 2020 over 100 times on the ground, not by Zoom, in former centrally planned economies, including Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, and later Cuba, Iran, China, where food prices were completely or mostly fixed by the state. During one more disclosure that the translators don't have, I should have put this in. I grew up on a farm, a real farm, in Beckwith Township, Lanark County, Eastern Ontario in the 1960s. So I am very familiar with what life is like on a real farm, not a hobby farm. During the last 18 months, an urban legend has emerged amongst some in the Ottawa political process that grocery retailers are engaged in, quote, predatory pricing, quote, profiteering, and, quote, creating greedflation. I testified twice before the Finance Committee of the House in the last 6 months. I provided the actual, empirical, statistical, StatsCan data and audited financial statements of Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro, with whom I have no relationship other than I buy groceries there, showing the grocery retailing in Canada and the U.S. has been notoriously low net profit margin industry for 3/4 of a century, averaging 3.2 to 3.5. Members of Parliament, it's time to go back to school. 250 years of economic theory and practice and over 50 Nobel Prizes in economics have taught us that a decentralized economy of private decision makers making private, not political decisions over the value chain of any company, capital investment, R&D, production, pricing, produce the incredible standard of living of the high-income countries documented by the World Bank. And Joseph Schumpeter taught us the why and the how. Competition causes firms to endlessly innovate in order to differentiate, to try to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage, the holy grail of any private firm. And this creates gales of creative destruction. But at the center of this edifice called the market economy or capitalism is price discovery. This is why price controls of any kind on any product or any service anywhere is deadly and destructive, for it kills price discovery and thus efficient pricing decisions by impersonal private market forces, and replaced by the very worst kind of economic policy decision-making, political and bureaucratic decision-making, grounded in the false belief of non-market people, including professors like me, of their superior knowledge concerning the marginal prices of millions and millions of products and services sold every minute in the market. This explains why Nobel laureate Friedman was correct in noting that no low-income or middle-income country has ever in human history become a high-income country unless they transformed to decentralized economic decision-making. Indeed, none of the 37 OECD high-income countries have adopted food price controls as a long-term policy. By contrast, price controls, especially food prices, are regulated, fixed, and controlled in many poor countries. The poster child for price fixing of food is Venezuela's Maduro, where inflation is now at 283%. But don't forget Argentina, from Peron through to the Kirchmers, with inflation running now at 211%, or Turkey's Erdogan, with inflation at 65%. Each of them are doing food price controls. Let's quickly turn to the largest and most successful economy in the world since the 1880s. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. Is the Congress or the liberal Biden administration discussing formal price food regulations or disguised food price fixing by ordering grocery CEOs to lower prices? Answer, a loud, crashing? No. So why then are some MPs in government trying to adopt de facto food price controls similar to Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, and other poor developing countries with disastrous economic consequences, records that produce poverty, instead of emulating the U.S. economic policies of government hands-off concerning price discovery? I will now close on a very personal note. It's likely some MPs listening will think there's another ivory tower academic quoting all the books, doesn't know the real world. So I want to talk about the real world. I lived in Warsaw 4 to 5 times a year in a private apartment from March 91 throughout the 90s. Poland regulated food prices until 1995. I tried to buy food in the local grocery stores quite a few times, but the lines were very long. The shelves were often empty.
Mr. Lee, we're unfortunately at time. I'm going to let you finish your thought in terms of, about the idea of not regulating food prices, but just quickly because we're at time.
I've just got 2 sentences left. The lines were very long and the food was disgusting. So why? Well, prices were set by the state with no understanding of marginal costs. Because of the conceit, and that's Nobel laureate Hayek's word, of politicians and bureaucrats, they know more about optimal prices of the millions of food items than the decentralized market of price discovery. No, we in the public sector do not. Final comment. No brain in the world, not even President Xi and his millions of minions, can process the trillions of bits of information daily in an economy concerning prices and scarcity at the margin. Members of Parliament, Pogo warned us. We've met the enemy, and it is us, not the grocery retailers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. We'll now turn to Mr. McCann for up to 5 minutes.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président et membres du comité. Je vous remercie.
Hello, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today. The work done by the committee on issues related to food price inflation is essential to further deepening our knowledge and putting forward solutions.
Before the committee and recommended that the government do more to release data and analysis to improve our understanding of the drivers of food price inflation. I appreciate the committee making that recommendation in its report and the government acting on it last fall. StatsCan's Food Price Data Hub and increased focus on the issue inside Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is a step in the right direction, but much more can be done to provide public data and analysis to inform the policy debate. Today, I want to offer several observations and make another recommendation. First, policymakers are not usually lucky enough to get such consistent evidence as we see around food price inflation. The Bank of Canada, academics, researchers, and public institutions in the U.S. and the EU all point to food inflation being driven higher by a long list of causes. Most conclude that inflation will slow when those causes, from Russia's war to the higher interest rates, resolve themselves. The consistent evidence underscores that increasing food prices is not the fault of a single actor, and stabilizing them will require multiple different actions. Second, the grocery retail landscape in Canada is more competitive than we often give it credit for. Even last year's Competition Bureau report concluded that grocery margins have increased by a modest yet meaningful amount, highlighted that grocery sector is a low-margin competitive business. The Bureau cites foreign retailers who admit that it could be difficult to compete on cost in Canada. Third, food price inflation is a value chain challenge that requires value chain solutions. This is underscored when a retailer freezes its prices and then passes that freeze on to its suppliers. Tension between suppliers and retailers can be a healthy force to keep food price inflation in check when the appropriate checks and balances are in place. An effective and meaningful code of conduct can be one of those checks and balances. Fourth, grocery stores are big, complex spaces, and the food in a shopping cart behaves in different ways. Much attention is paid to the top-line food inflation number, but when you dig deeper, you see that in December, you could get fish, some vegetables, and bananas for less than you could a year ago. While no one expects deflation in the overall food price index, the variability in the food basket speaks to the different drivers of inflation and the need for different solutions to stabilize them. A final observation is that it is challenging when we try to pass judgment on data alone. If you told people that retailers' net cash income in 2022 was 31% higher than it was the 5-year average before, some may claim profiteering. If you saw a net worth increase by double digits between 2019 and 2021 in the midst of pandemic, some people would worry about the impact that has on food prices. But those numbers don't come from the retail sector in Canada, they come from Canadian farms. No one should claim that farms' incomes are rising too fast, but it shows how it can be inappropriate to draw conclusions on the drivers of food inflation without a much deeper understanding of the broader context along the supply chain. We've seen government take a more thoughtful approach to issues like this. In the midst of the global supply chain disruptions, the government launched a national supply chain task force with the objective of making independent recommendations regarding short and long-term actions to alleviate supply chain congestion. I recommend that the government launch a food value chain task force. The task force should have 3 priority mandates. First, it should build on StatsCan's data hub by producing detailed analysis on food inflation drivers along the value chain. Second, it should make concrete recommendations for the public and private sector with a focus on where Canadians can act. This should include retail, but it must also include an examination of systemic issues, including supply chain fluidity, regulatory burden, taxes, underinvestment in R&D, and declines in productivity growth, and make recommendations that can drive those costs down. Finally, it should look at where the government can act to support those Canadians that are hardest hit by higher food prices. Food Banks Canada gave Canada a D+ in its inaugural poverty report card, highlighting that the impact of food price inflation is a broader poverty challenge that must involve solutions beyond the food system scope. Unfortunately, the Supply Chain Task Force has shown that writing the action plan can be the easy part. Acting on it is much harder. Complex issues do not always lend themselves to the silver bullets governments seem to prefer. While it is easy to say all options are on the table to stabilize prices, there seems to be a focus on the retail sector, with other more sensitive but potentially more impactful policy changes actually off the table. As food inflation shows, many of these systemic issues and pressures will remain. Even if the political pressure falls as food inflation falls too, the opportunity will still exist to do something substantive. It may not be easy, but it'll be worthwhile.
Geez, that was almost perfect. 4 minutes and 59 seconds. Well done, Mr. McCann, and no stranger to this committee. So, yeah, learned some lessons, says the colleagues here. Okay, Mr. Jansen, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Marcus Jansen, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada. And I also, during the day, have a pepper greenhouse just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia in Abbotsford. Here before you to discuss the pressing issue of stabilizing food prices in Canada, a concern that deeply affects the Canadian fruit and vegetable growers as well as all Canadian citizens. FVGC represents approximately 14,000 farms producing 120 types of crops, and we contribute about $6.8 billion to the Canadian economy. A 2022 survey conducted by our organization revealed that close to 44% of our growers are operating at a loss presently, and 3/4 have difficulty offsetting production cost increases, which would include the carbon tax, P2 plastics program, tariffs on fertilizer, and aggressive targets for reducing fertilizer emissions. Those challenges, including Bill C-234, risk the sector's affordability and sustainability going forward. Bill C-234 is at a critical place, and by eliminating heating and cooling exemptions to greenhouses and barns, this jeopardizes our competitiveness, as we heard from the previous witnesses, relative to particularly the U.S. We propose a series of actions that would include the following: rejecting the proposed amendments to 234, remove the P2 plastic program in order to further evaluate how, particularly when it comes to PLUs, have unintended impacts on costs and therefore food prices, elimination of the fertilizer tariffs in order to not disproportionately negatively affect domestic producers. We need, again, the idea of having a more cohesive regulatory conversation with government before policies are in place. we would look for the quick passage of 280, which is essentially the PACA-like trust to be reinstated. And lastly, we would support an increased resolve in order to bring the Grocer Code of Conduct into reality. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. We'll now turn to questions. Colleagues, the way we're going to do this, we'll do our first 6-minute panel, and then I'm going to go 4 minutes for the Conservatives and Liberals and 2 minutes on that side. Just that's the only way we can be in time. I believe I'm over to the Tories. Mr. Steinley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm having trouble rounding this all out because we're talking about food increases across Canada in the grocery stores, but the policies, Mr. Jansen, you just mentioned, P2 plastics, fertilizer reduction, carbon tax, are all policies that the Liberal government have brought in. And I've never heard a government argue so much that the policies that they brought in when they were actually successful. The desired result of a carbon tax is to increase prices on people so they change their behavior. Every Liberal has stood in the House of Commons and said that. So their carbon tax is working when it comes to food prices. They've increased the food price and changed people's behavior across our country because they can't afford to eat as much as they did before the carbon tax came into place. So I'd ask Mr. McCann, is that not the point of a carbon tax brought in by this Liberal government to increase prices and change consumer behavior?
So that is certainly the principle behind a carbon tax, is that you're going to add the cost related to the emissions of a product. That is the intent. I think if you go to the government's website, that's very similar language to what they use. I think we have this reality where the food system is a source of emissions. Producing food in Canada and around the world represents about 10% of global emissions. There are opportunities to reduce those emissions. I think when you get into a discussion is what's the most effective approach to reducing emissions on farm. We see different approaches in Canada and around the world. And I think that there are other opportunities that someone spoke to earlier as to how you could drive that decarbonization of the food system.
Out of Saskatchewan, the Global Institute for Food Security has just come forward with a study in partnership with the University of British Columbia that says Canadians' total agriculture emissions, as part of the emissions in Canada, agriculture is 8%. I repeat, 8%. All other jurisdictions are around that 25% and higher as portion of their agriculture emissions. Would it not be better for us to take our sustainability across the world and help people lower their emissions than continue to punish the people that create food in our country? Because, like I said, it's very weird for a government to be so upset that the policy they implement is actually working and food prices are higher because of their policies.
So I think a couple of things can be true at the same time, right? We can have one of the lowest emission food producing systems in the world, and there still be an opportunity to reduce our emissions further, right? Often the big winners from reducing emissions are Canadian farmers themselves. Fertilizer emissions represent fertilizer that farmers have paid for that's not doing the job that it was intended to do. Again, I think the question gets to be, what's the right approach do you do to kind of build on that competitive advantage? How do you take the low emissions agriculture that we have, turn it into a competitive advantage, turn it into a tool for good? And I think there's a lot of opportunities to take different approaches that help farmers out and grow that Canadian advantage we have.
As you're a farmer, I just want to say thank you for the job you do and appreciate your answers to my questions.
Thank you. We know that front-of-pack labeling is going to cost $8 billion, and we heard you say earlier that the new P2 plastics ban is also going to add on cost to farmers. And I'm wondering, Mr. Jansen, if you can speak to that. We've heard it's going to cost upwards of $6 billion, the new P2 plastics ban. You mentioned the PLU stickers. So what will this do to food costs, to food availability, and to food waste?
I think the industry is very willing to look at science-based opportunities to reduce plastics. I think we see that already in the last 10 years. For example, lower profile clamshells that use less plastic. I think the industry's perspective would be we need a better system to not only reduce plastic use, but also to reuse it. And as opposed to eliminating plastics from the system, because the reality is there really are no alternatives to move, especially perishable products, in an effective way over the kind of distances we have to face in Canada without using plastics in some form.
Thank you. And Mr. McCann, we heard from some witnesses previous in 2023 that perhaps this wouldn't affect our trading partners, and it wouldn't affect trade with our trading partners. And the U.S. is our closest trading partner, and we've heard that they don't want to have anything to do with this plastics ban, and they're not on board. So how would this P2 plastics ban for fresh produce impact our trading partners and trade relations that we have in getting the food to this country that we need?
One of the greatest advantages our food system has is a relatively open border with the United States, and the ability of food to go north and south plays an important role in food security for Canadians and economic prosperity for North America and environmental sustainability. And anytime you thicken that border, it has an impact on all of those things. And I always use a bit of a measure of who else is talking about this issue. And my counterparts at Public Policy Institute in the United States have raised the plastic ban as a concern that their industry in the U.S. has. And so clearly there is concern about the impact that it will have on the border, the added impact on U.S. exporters that are a source of food security in Canada.
Mr. Lewis, over to you. Thank you. 6 minutes, my friend.
I'm not taking a call. I'm just setting my timer. I appreciate the witnesses all being here. Maybe I would direct my questions first to Mr. McCann from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Off your opening remarks, you mentioned, suggested a food affordability task force, which would be something similar to our National Supply Chain Task Force, and how we can take more action with that. Some of the recommendations you made were on the retail side, supply chain side, regulatory issue side, declines in productivity. We're all looking out for our farmers, and we're looking out at the end of the chain for customers, for Canadians and food prices. So, how do you see a task force addressing those issues? And then, if you can also expand specifically on the Canadians that are most affected, that are food insecure, affected by the high price of food.
The starting point needs to be that this is a systemic challenge, right? That this is not. Food prices aren't a retail issue, they're not a farmer issue, they're a food chain issue, and we need to look for systemic solutions. And the reality is that, for better or for worse, it can be hard to have some of those more thoughtful dialogues around what are the challenges and what are the different tools that we have to solve them. So I think a task force approach, and we've seen this recently, can really dive into what are those different drivers, what are the different approaches that we can take, how much of an impact do some of these different forces have on food price inflation. And so I think that, again, there are some easy solutions, there are short-term solutions, but there are also longer-term solutions. I really like to talk a lot about R&D. We don't often appreciate the important role that a more productive food system has on driving down costs, on keeping food more affordable. But the reality is we're not investing as much in R&D in Canada as we used to, and we're losing out on some of that advantage. And so I think there's an opportunity to look at some of those long-term causes, not just on short-term issues that were talked about.
Appreciate you saying that, and you're talking about the longer conversation as I set a timer because I have only a few minutes to talk to you, kind of speaks volumes right there. But a lot of it comes down to sustainability in agriculture. We need to help those farmers build the resilience to address climate change that we're facing. And we need to do it in a way that helps farmers produce more and be more profitable at the same time. So you're talking about R&D. What types of measures are working right now, and what would you like to see more of?
You know, I think the reality is that we've shied away from additional investments in R&D in Canada. We do. Some of the unsung heroes in the fight around sustainability and food affordability are our plant breeders in this country that are doing really, really good work to make more productive varieties, more sustainable varieties. We don't do enough to create the conditions for more of that work. I think that's just one example of many. I want to go back to the question about poverty, though, because I think that we often lose sight of that, and we talk about this in the context of an agriculture discussion. Again, this agriculture committee here holding these hearings, but these issues and those Canadians that are most impacted by this are dealing with a broad set of issues that require, again, a different, broader set of solutions at the end of the day. I think if you look at the pressure that our food banks are under is quite significant. It's greater now than it's been in recent memory. And if you look at the analysis done by Food Banks Canada in their report card, I think it's a very challenging assessment of our approach to these issues, and should require us to think differently about how do we use, again, a different set of tools outside of food system solutions to address that food affordability and accessibility issue.
Thank you for that. We also have the potential to help feed the world. And I know you've done quite a bit of research about turning agricultural sustainability into a competitive advantage for Canada, because that would not only, let's say, lower the prices of food here for Canadians, but it gives us a chance to export. Can you kind of expand on how we can, what kind of measures we can take to help feed people here in Canada and as well as globally?
Again, those are two different, but I think equally important objectives at the end of the day. Again, the challenges around agriculture are not simple. I mean, again, it is a complex economic, organic system at the end of the day. I think one of the first things that we need to do is recognize the strategic role that agriculture plays in the economy in Canada. We don't recognize the important role that agriculture plays. We don't treat it as that critical strategic sector that it should be. And I think that there's just that starting point to recognize that agriculture is different. It is a great asset to Canada. It can be an innovation asset. It can be a geopolitical asset. It can be a sustainability asset. And we need to think differently. I think, unfortunately, we're looking at missing some opportunities. I think the Sustainable Ag Strategy has potential, but I think that there's increasing concern that it's not going to be as ambitious and strategic as it could be. And I think it's important to think, again, differently about this issue than we have in the past.
I appreciate that. Mr. Jansen, I wanted to ask you a quick question in the last minute, the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada. We briefly talked about the grocery sector code of conduct in your opening remarks. In the words of Mr. McCann, he said value chain challenges require value chain solutions. So can you give us what you'd like to see from the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada in a grocery code of conduct, and how that will help our farmers?
I think at the end of the day, we would like serious consideration be given to it be legislated.
Mr. Lewis, you've got 15 seconds, but I'm going to take that back from you. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For once, I'm not the one who's getting my time eaten into. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Jansen, I'd like to maybe allow you some time to finish your thoughts. You mentioned earlier that it would be important to have a grocery store code of conduct. What if it were not implemented or only partially implemented in the industry? Do you think that that would be viable? Do you really need it to be implemented fully?
That didn't come through.
Interpretation. I will repeat. Earlier, you mentioned that it would be important to have a grocery store code of conduct. You said it was important for your industry. If there is a situation where some companies don't consent to the code of conduct, how would you implement it if not all players are participating? Do you think that it should be mandatory?
Yes, I think if all participants can't come to a consensus, then I believe really the only choice for the industry would to make it mandatory. And I recognize the challenges that would have working across different provinces, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean it can't be done and isn't the right thing to do.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur McCann.
Thank you. Mr. McCann, you also mentioned that it would be important and that groceries are complex and it would be important to have a grocery store code of conduct. How does that match up with your data? Would it be possible to implement a code of conduct partially and that those who don't want to participate now join later, or do you think it should be mandatory? We can look to other countries to see what happened there. Most of the time, there's a bit of an evolution. Usually, there's a voluntary code, but most of the time, at the end of the day, there is a mandatory code that is implemented, and it's quite comprehensive. It's easy to understand that if all the stakeholders are not involved, then the code of conduct will not have the impact it should. And I think that we will, well, I do agree that just because something is difficult, that shouldn't be an excuse to extricate yourself. Yes, Canadian jurisdictions are complex. There's an obligation of having provinces around the table in order to have a mandatory code of conduct. Perhaps that's not so simple, but it's doable. We just need shared willingness. Mr. Lee, I liked your introduction. You shake things up a little bit. It's quite interesting. I agree with you on many points. Indeed, governments can't make all of the decisions. Capitalism does work well, but with regulation. Here's an example. Taxes that are on income that are gradual according to income. You said that the government should not get involved in price fixing. Do you think that a grocery store code of conduct is a positive thing? And might you have other suggestions to recommend today?
Thank you, Mr. Perron. And I'm certainly not a libertarian who says there's no role for government. My late father was 42 years in the government of Canada, and half my family worked in the government. The government of Canada is one of the most qualified, highly trained, and skilled governments in the world, and I use StatsCan and other government data in my classes exclusively. So there's no question about the quality. That wasn't my point. My point is that there are value chain issues, and then I'll get to your question very quickly, but I don't believe that parliamentarians should be trying to get into the value chain of a company and micromanage the strategic decisions over marketing and R&D investment and plant location and pricing, because that's not the role. The role of the government is to be the referee of the hockey game and not to tell Sidney Crosby when to shoot the puck, at what time in the game, and at what level and what speed. That's where you're going, and I don't mean you personally, but you're by focusing on the micro instead of more macro issues like reducing barriers to entry to discourage or reduce the concentration in grocery retailing, which is high. It's not the highest in Canada. We know telecom is higher. We know banking is higher. Airlines are higher. I use the concentration ratio every week in every class, but grocery retailing is high. So we need to encourage foreign investment because it's probably going to come from the States because the large capital needed to enter this industry. One more quick point before I run out of time. The Competition Bureau talked about this in their excellent report. And I don't think enough people have talked about this in Ottawa, including your committee. Online grocery retailing is going to be, I believe, a disruptive force to grocery pricing because we know that all online e-commerce makes the industry more competitive because the prices are much more transparent. So anybody can sit in their chair in their wardrobe, in their bathrobe, and literally compare prices across a whole range of companies rather than have to go to the store to find out what the apples are or the cucumbers. Online pricing is going, online e-commerce grocery competition is going to, I think, change the dynamic of grocery competition in Canada.
Thank you very much to both of you. That's time. I'll go to Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McCann, thanks for coming back before our committee. I just wanted to pick up, the carbon tax or carbon pricing is a frequent guest of topic before this committee. And yes, it is true. The rationale is that, you are trying to use a market-based mechanism to change behavior. And the other part of the argument is that if the behavior does change, you necessarily incur a lower cost. But, in your opening statement, you were careful to point out to this committee that we shouldn't grab individual facets of information that when we're talking about food price inflation, we have to look at it as a whole. So I'm just wondering, on the topic of the carbon tax and fuel price volatility, in the previous panel, I was making mention of the fact that diesel fuel, in 2022 was priced as high as $2.30 a liter. It's now down to $1.70. We've seen worldwide massive fluctuations in energy prices, whether it be natural gas, propane, gasoline, or diesel. So can you put the carbon pricing in the context of that volatility that exists out there, how important it is for us to keep that in mind? And maybe also take into account that, since 2019, oil and gas profits have been substantial. And a lot of that wealth seems to be flowing out to investors and to paying out dividends rather than coming and servicing the Canadian economy.
So I think that there's a couple of important things to keep in mind when we think about the carbon tax in agriculture and food, because those things are slightly different. So first, the government made a decision with the GST to exempt the food system because it's different, right? I think that there's an interesting precedent to think about. Should food have been treated differently when it came to the carbon tax? The carbon tax today also is a relatively small amount, but it is an amount that's growing, and we expect that the impact will continue to increase. The reality is the vast majority of emissions from agriculture and food are exempt from carbon pricing today, but they all aren't. And some of those, I think one of the challenges that we get with the carbon price as an effective policy tool is that there is a lot of inconsistency in how it's being applied. If you're a grain farmer, you're treated differently than if you're a greenhouse grower, and if you're a livestock farmer, you're treated differently again. And so I think that there's that really challenging policy environment around it. And I think it also comes to the reality that if what we really want to do is drive down emissions in agriculture, there are probably better ways to do it than through carbon pricing, if you look at what's happening around the world. On the challenge of volatility in fuel prices, and again, it's not just fuel prices, fertilizer prices have been volatile, have been impacting farmers. It is a challenge that farmers deal with. Again, as was mentioned earlier, farmers don't have many options whenever these costs increase with this volatility that impacts them. They don't have the flexibility to pass it on to someone else. It is often their own income, their own livelihood that gets impacted by those price increases. But when you think about kind of those long-term solutions to volatility, helping farmers switch off of fossil fuels, looking at other sources can be one of those really effective mechanisms to help them manage the volatility in oil and gas. But I think that there's a different set of policy tools that can help them get to that point.
Thank you, and that's a great segue to my question to Mr. Jansen. C234. I, along with the Green Party, with the Bloc Québécois, we were happy to support that bill at third reading because in my interpretation of that bill, as Mr. McCann mentioned, it's in line and in the spirit of the original Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act in that there are already exemptions for farm fuels, farm machinery, and farming activity. And I see the provisions in C234 being in the spirit of the original law. The Liberals in 2018 recognized there is a special place for agricultural activity, and I think that C234 keeps in line with it, and I was happy to support it at third reading. And I think that I'm going to keep my vote consistent with the vote that was at third reading. But Mr. Jansen, just on the subject of volatility, that can have a significant impact, like fuel price volatility. And we did as the House of Commons program in a sunset clause. Can you talk about with respect to the greenhouse sector? Are there some promising opportunities in the next decade whereby operators of greenhouses are able to switch to a more stable fuel source or mechanism to heat their greenhouses? Can we just talk about some of the light that exists at the end of the tunnel so you're not subjected to that volatility?
I'm hard pressed to suggest that the greenhouse industry has the potential to completely disconnect from fossil fuels in the next 10 years. That being said, I think there are some very promising opportunities when it comes to plant genetics that are more energy efficient and still can be grown in a northern climate. That's the challenge. There are meaningful amounts of research being done on what we call closed greenhouse systems. where essentially you have a heat pump concept on obviously a larger scale. The challenge there is the capital cost to remain competitive in a marketplace where you're competing against California and Mexico, especially in certain parts of the year. But just to personalize it, when I started in the greenhouse, to use 42, 45 cubic meters of gas per square meter was considered very efficient. Now it's 38, 36. Some of our really elite growers go to 33. So it's that incremental improvement that we can make. The challenge is that the carbon tax being applied is being increased at a far, far higher rate than science and technology can keep up with.
Thank you to you both. I gave a little bit extra time, Mr. McGregor, so I expect a Christmas card next Christmas. Okay, Mr. Epp, 4 minutes. We'll have to shorten it. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I'll begin with Dr. Lee. Last spring, you testified to this committee that StatScan evidence, and this has come up already, described increases in diesel fuel, fertilizer, crop protection products, and trucking costs. In my discussions with industry, I'm going to add packaging costs and interest costs to that list of costs that are hitting the industry. One of those things is not like the rest, and that interest cost, I think, the only one of those cost components that is not attracting a carbon tax. So to move forward on food affordability, given the discussion earlier on the success of the carbon tax, should we remove the carbon tax from the other four or add it to interest costs somehow and fabricate some carbon in that component? Dr. Lee, please.
Sorry, thank you. I'm not used to muting, unmuting. I was listening to the conversation in the previous round and this round, and I'm going to answer it tangentially. I will, full disclosure, I believe in Pigou taxes. I'm referring to Professor Pigou, Cambridge, 100 years ago, who said if you want to discourage something, make it more expensive with a tax. So liquor taxes or Pigou taxes are what we now call carbon taxes. So are cigarette taxes. The principle's been around for a very long time. Make something more expensive and you consume less of it. So it's kind of hard to argue with that. I think the problem, and it reminds me a lot of the debates over the HST back in 1991, with Michael Wilson as the finance minister, and it's the aggressivity. And I'm now talking about the carbon tax. I think a solution to answer your question is as the previous witness just said, it's rising so quickly that technology and investment can't keep up. And I think the criticism is not the carbon tax, it's the speed of the implementation of the carbon tax. Instead of squishing it through in I think it's 5 years, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe we should be amortizing that over 10 years or 12 years. I debated very quickly the head of Eco-Fiscal Commission at McGill, who's very pro-carbon tax too, and we both agree it's going to take 50 years to decarbonize the American and Canadian economies, not 5 or 7 or 10 or 12 years. So maybe we should acknowledge that and stretch out the amortization, which means a lower rate of increase so that the growers and the farmers and the greenhouse operators can adapt and adjust incrementally because it's not going up so radically, so quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I hear you not supporting the amendments on 234 and the shrinking sunset time. I'm going to shift gears a bit. There are those that are calling for more competition in the grocery retail sector. In fact, the Minister of Innovation is working the phones supposedly to make that happen. We've talked about the profits at the retail sector here at on average 3.7%, but that only would reduce a basket of groceries if they were zero from $25 to $24. And I'm wondering how a zero profit, if that's what was our goal, would attract more foreign or expanded smaller grocery retailers here in Canada. Would it not make more sense, and I'm going to the Grocery Code of Conduct here, wouldn't it not make more sense to have the market-based level playing field, industry-led, uniform across Canada in existence? Would that not attract? Now, I'll cite the example of Australia, which has a voluntary code. It has attracted another retailer since the existence of the code. The UK has also attracted another retail since a mandatory code was put into the UK. So I'm going to start with Mr. McCann. Can you comment on those dynamics in other jurisdictions and how the code could potentially help bring more competitors into Canada?
In about 45 seconds, if you could, Mr. McCann, and then we'll have to wrap up.
So I think the simple reality is that a well-functioning supply chain is good for everybody that's involved in it. It's good for the farmers, it's good for the retailers, it's good for the consumers at the end of the day. And so the question is, what role can a code play in making that function better? I think we've certainly seen the experience around the world that it does have a positive impact. Lots of examples from the UK and Australia where it's improved that fluidity and made it a more attractive, more effective marketplace for everybody involved.
Mr. Jansen? Quickly.
I would concur with those comments. I think at some point there has to be a more fixed timeline to putting this in place. And I believe if there's a political will, there's a way.
Thank you very much. We'll have to leave it at that. We're going to go to Mr. Carr, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start just by quickly addressing something my colleague from Saskatchewan, Mr. Steinley, said during his intervention. The purpose of a price on pollution is to ensure that pollution is no longer free. If my colleagues across the way disagree with that sentiment, then I think there's conversation for us to have. Furthermore, however, a price on pollution is also designed to incentivize innovation, to make sure that that's a critical component of decarbonization. It does not, as Mr. Charlebois quite emphatically expressed through data and studies that he's undertaken a couple of moments ago, that this is not passing costs on at the retail level. So, Mr. McCann, you had said that this is complex. I imagine that an axing of a tax, therefore, would not be a silver bullet that all of a sudden ensures that we see a stabilization of food prices. Do you share the view, Mr. McCann, that Mr. Charlebois expressed earlier during this committee that the price on pollution is not contributing directly to retail costs on food?
Point of order. We'll just pause the clock for a second if we could. Just make sure it's a point of order.
It is. Mr. Charlebois said there's not enough data to prove if the carbon tax is affecting food prices. Mr. Carr is putting words in his mouth.
So we'll make sure that everyone will have access to the blues and the testimony. I paused the clock. Mr. Steinley, it's Mr. Carr's time. We're getting close to the hour. Mr. Carr, I still have you at about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. The floor is back to you.
Appreciate the debate, Mr. Chair. Mr. McCann, do you share the view, or do you believe that the carbon tax is having a direct impact at the retail level on the prices of food in the country?
So, again, I think what the professor said earlier was that, again, we don't have a lot of data. The reality is that retail prices are set by a variety of different factors.
Okay.
Farmers will say retail prices don't reflect what happens at the farm gate. I think a lot of people along the value chain will say retail prices don't reflect the different policies and impacts along the way.
So can I ask you, sorry to interrupt, Mr. McCann, but when politicians then say that a price on pollution is resulting in an increase in the cost of food in Canada, which I hear every single day in the House of Commons from colleagues across the way, you're saying that there is no data to support that argument. Do I understand you correctly?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned something earlier that I thought was quite profound, and I'm glad you did, and that's regarding poverty. I come from Manitoba, largest per capita Indigenous population in the country, which unfortunately, due to all sorts of intergenerational trauma and wrongs committed towards Indigenous peoples on the part of the government of Canada, governments of Canada over the years, the poverty rate for kids in Manitoba is at about 20%. Now, I will note that's after 8 years of a Conservative government in Manitoba. That's 7.4% higher than the national average. A colleague of mine has recently put forward a piece of legislation to look at addressing food in schools, nutrition programs, and establishing a framework. I know that the new Premier of Manitoba, Premier Canoe, has talked about this and is currently investing tens of millions of dollars to ensure that there's food stability in schools. Can you just comment on the role that you believe industry may play in helping to support the establishment of nutrition programs in school, and whether that's around food waste, whether that's in regards to some of the other policies you noted earlier vis-a-vis poverty? I'd be interested to get your view. We're probably running out of time, but if there is time for Mr. Jansen to add something in relation specifically to that, I'd appreciate it as well. Thank you.
So I think often there's an untold story around the good work that the value chain actors today do in addressing poverty issues. So if you look at companies like some of the large retailers, if you look at farm groups, farm associations, they are major donors and contributors to food lunch programs, to food banks. And so it's like we have some mechanisms that are there, but I think there's interesting opportunities to create better conditions where maybe there's better tax credits or other tools that go further to encourage value chain actors to do more to donate food or to direct surplus foods to these spaces where it's really needed.
I think in BC we have a program called Ag in the Classroom, which basically coordinates primary production to elementary, middle school age classrooms. And in addition to that, we also have what we refer to as the Buy BC program, which encourages institutions, public institutions, schools included in that to purchase local production.
We're going to leave it at that. Thank you, gentlemen. 2 minutes, please, if you could, Monsieur Parent.
We'll give it our best shot. Mr. Lee, back to you. Earlier you said that we have to eliminate barriers and obstacles for competition. Do you have any recommendations you can make to the committee?
Yes. Rather than my approach is focusing on the macro, not the micro, and doing what's called indirect regulation rather than direct regulation. So let's bring that down to brass tacks and down to earth. The Competition Bureau, which correctly has identified concentration, has not acknowledged fully that they have approved every acquisition of the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm not here to throw rocks or bricks at the Competition Bureau because they're excellent people. But maybe they should be either through order in council or through amendment to the legislation, put some kind of a notional cap on the concentration ratio. When you get concentration ratios up in the 70 and 80 and 90%, which we have, and we have several industries, we're getting real problems of lack of competitiveness. And it's a direct consequence from such high levels of concentration, or to put it the other way, the Competition Bureau is approving too many acquisitions.
Et je vais me tourner vers M. McCann.
Mr. McCann, you made some specific recommendations earlier. Can you please send them to us? Or if you want, you can repeat them. You have 20 seconds to repeat them. Indeed. I think that the task force should have three roles. One is to produce better analysis in order for us to better know what the carbon tax impact on prices is. Second, what does have an impact and what are the solutions? And third would be the accessibility and affordability. What solutions exist outside of the food system that can remedy the increase of food prices?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think, Mr. McCann, this committee, of course, has been involved in this study for quite some time, and I'm very thankful that, I got the unanimous support of my colleagues when I proposed the original motion for study. But I think one of the great benefits of this study and the increased focus on food price inflation has been recent amendments to the Competition Act. And, Bill C-56 got unanimous support in the House of Commons. It's now part of the Statutes of Canada. There are other provisions in Bill C-59 as well. And I just put that in the context of your opening remarks about how sometimes we suffer from a little bit of a data gap in Canada. And I'm just wondering, can you add any more to the conversation about what these increased legislative powers to the Competition Bureau, what you hope they will result in, particularly now that the Competition Bureau has more legislative muscle when it comes to market studies and the ability to compel that information?
So clearly it will help better fill the gap that exists, right? Even I think the Competition Bureau report from last summer acknowledged There are limitations. It certainly didn't answer all of the questions that are there. I think it creates a lot of uncertainty around what exactly is happening and what do we really understand. Also important to understand that, especially in a concentrated sector like the retail, may very well be limitations with what they can make public at the end of the day. And so, this is a really small piece of the puzzle. I think it's interesting to think maybe how things would have been 20 years ago had the Competition Bureau had these powers then, but they didn't. We are where we are, and I think ultimately this is about an incremental or very marginal impact on the actual issue of food prices.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Colleagues, just before you go off, first of all, thank our witnesses for the second panel. So thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing on Thursday, we were coming really to the end of the amount of witnesses that were left based on what you had submitted. In fact, the clerk had trouble because all the witnesses had either been exhausted or a few were declined and weren't able to participate. But we do have the Competition Bureau. Speaking of the Competition Bureau, they are coming for the first hour on Thursday. And then the second hour is going to be draft instructions to our analysts in terms of what we've heard so that they can get a first report up. And we're also going to look to adopt the subcommittee report and any other committee business that we feel is pertinent. On the 13th, we intend to have the CEO from Costco, I believe it is, Madam Clerk. So the CEO from Costco will be here, and we are working to try to have Minister Champagne appear. Not yet confirmed, but we're working on that. And then on February 15th will be the first day of our horticulture study. So the clerk is working on that. We did talk about doing C355 in the first hour of Thursday. Mr. Lewis would like a little bit more time, but we'll make sure that we have him up because that is a piece of legislation that this committee ultimately has to study as well. But that is our schedule until February break. We will see you all on Thursday and meeting adjourned.